Welcome back to History Chatter. My name is Anirban. I host this podcast. We've done now, my producer tells me, close to 100 episodes over the last 4 years since August 2020. Therefore, we deserve some celebrations, and we propose to do that with a special episode with Professor Nayanjot Lahiri, who is also celebrating the release of one of her landmark books, 20th anniversary, in fact, of one of her landmark books, Finding Forhotten Cities, How the Indus Civilization Was Discovered, which she first published in 2004. Now the 20th anniversary edition comes with a new afterword, which we'll discuss quite appropriately towards the end of this conversation. But let me begin with an introduction of Professor Lahiri first. Professor Nayanjot Lahiri is Professor of History at Ashoka University, which she joined in 2016. Before that, she was at the Delhi University, where she taught from 1982. It means that Professor Lahiri has been teaching now for 42 long years, which is, far too long for any of us to count. Professor Lahiri started publishing books since the early 90s. Her first book was Pre-Ahom Assam, and immediately the Archaeology of Indian Trade Routes was released. But by the 21st century, really, the new millennium, her research clearly takes a very distinct and new turn, where she publishes the book Decline and Fall of the Indus Civilization, and then Finding Forhotten Cities, How the Indus Civilization Was Discovered in 2004-5. Eventually, she moves to even larger territories of historiography, heritage, monuments, and concerns with the past in the present as such. Books like Marshalling the Past, Ancient India and Modern Histories in 2012, then Ashoka in Ancient India, 2015, Monuments Matter, India's Archaeological Heritage Since Independence, 2017, Timepieces, A Whistle-Stop Tour of Ancient India, 2018, and Archaeology and Public Purpose, Writing on and by Amen Deshpande, was published in 2021. That is about Professor Lahiri's research, publication, and teaching, but she's been extremely busy also at the level of practice and outreach activity. She's been a member of Delhi Urban Art Commission. She's been a member of the Indian Council of Social Science Research, and the governing board of the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, which it was till some time ago. She was also the member of a committee which the government of India set up in 2010 to analyze the impact of ancient monuments and archaeological sites and remains ordinance. And part of the mandate of the team was to draft an alternative bill for Parliament, which became a law in 2010. She was awarded the Infosys Prize in Humanities in 2013 for the book Ashoka in Ancient India, and John F. Richards Prize of the American Historical Association for the best book in South Asian history in 2015. The introduction can go on and on, but speaking for myself, I am extremely fond of two of these books, her research on Ashoka, 2 books, and Finding Forhotten Cities. As a student of modern Indian history, they appeal to me personally for the way they depict the contemporary lives of ancient Indian history, and the ways so many of the discoveries and events and personalities that we sort of take for granted as settled and stable were unpacked as themselves part of a historical process. Welcome, Professor Lahiri, and thank you so much for agreeing to speak to me in History Chatter. I will begin with the first question straight away. Clearly, the book Finding Forgotten Cities marks, or seems to me to mark, a distinct turn in your interest as a historian and an archaeologist. Will you take us through how this book happened? You do mention at some length in the preface, but that's tantalizing more than anything else. We want the full story.
Thank you, Anirban, for having me on your program. It's a pleasure to speak with you, considering your background in history, and which is in contemporary history, but that you also have a deep interest in ancient India. Clearly shows that ancient India matters. It still matters. So, as far as Finding Forgotten Cities is concerned, the first thing I want to say is that it didn't begin as research on how the Indus civilization was discovered. When I first found documents pertaining to John Marshall, the Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India, who actually presided over the announcement of the discovery of the Indus civilization in 1924, and who also wrote these three big volumes on the excavations at Mohenjo-daro, which were published in 1931. So, when I sort of came face to face with him, it was through archives and through actually the appointment file of John Marshall, which I discovered in the British Library. It was then not in the British Library, the India Office collection, but today it is. In any case, it was a marvelous insight into the whole process, but also which this is something I already knew, but I think it's worth reiterating that Marshall was appointed as Director General when he was not yet 26. And it just shows you the wise shoulders of Lord Curzon, who was then the Viceroy, who wanted actually an excellent archaeologist, not necessarily trained in Indian archaeology. And he felt that on the job, if this was, an excellent young person, he would learn. And I think if you look at Marshall's career, that more than makes it evident that this is exactly what happened. In any case, after I found this file, I found some other stuff too, and I came back. I started working on the files in the National Archives with the idea in mind that I would actually write a biography of John Marshall. John Marshall was a kind of reserved person who didn't push himself in the limelight. And I'm particularly fond of such historical protagonists, notwithstanding the fact that this isn't true for my most favorite man of ancient India, Ashoka, who's very much there and pushing himself in the public domain. But if you think about M.N. Deshpande, I mean, as I'm talking to you, I'm just thinking, what are the commonalities? M.N. Deshpande also was somebody who didn't push himself in the limelight. So I felt I should write about Marshall. He was such an important figure. And I then also discovered a huge mountain of files in the head office of the Archaeological Survey of India. And I owe this to, a number of people, especially Charles Lewis, who had once headed the Oxford University Press, who introduced me to that material. Now, as I started sifting through that material, I came across a lot of stuff which pertained to Harappa, to Mohenjo-daro, to Kalibangan, and so on and so forth. So at that stage, I thought to myself that, look, here is Marshall, who first sees the seals of Harappa very early before he comes to India. He saw these seals, as he was preparing to come to India.
1901, yes.
That is correct.
Right.
And the announcement of the discovery is 1924.
24, yeah.
And Marshall remains as the Director General till 1928, after which he's there, under a kind of special dispensation. So it actually, the discovery of the Indus civilization from the time when he first saw those seals to, the whole process till 1924 dovetailed with a large part of his career. So, that's how I came to do this book. It was less by design and more by accident. When you discover material and you start grappling with what is in it, and you say that, hang on, there is something about one of the greatest discoveries relating to ancient India in here, and it's a story that is worth retelling. So, this is what I want to say about how I came to write this book. I didn't begin by writing this book. I began researching a biography of Marshall.
Thank you so much. In fact, whether or not there is a design to the making of the book is also something I have a feeling you've reflected over the years. And that reflection, since then, you present in the afterword, which I've just read this morning, when you sort of try and present a framework for the discovery of the Indus Valley civilization, as it were, comparing it with certain frameworks of the history of science as a domain. We'll come to that at the end, but let me come to the beginning of the book, really, chapter 1. It seems to me, reading the book, that the first phase, the early 19th century to the late 19th century, before Cunningham especially, the discovery, as it were, of Indian antiquities and antiquarians who chased after sculptures and coins, really, were a bunch of, for want of a better word, opportunist imposters. Some of them were so-called spies who traded information for a lucrative career after they retired. They were all fishing in some sort of troubled waters against the background of the great game of the Russia and the British Empire's sort of conflict around Afghanistan and the northwestern frontier as such. So what was that early phase like? I mean, here are people, there are so many similar characters in like Claude Martin, for instance, who later on contribute extremely sustainable and durable institutions and discoveries, but none of them had set out to do anything like that. You talk about two of those in the first chapter.
So, for me, one of my most favorite characters, there's of course Burns, but really my most favorite character there is Charles Masson, who that's a pseudonym
Yeah.
because he was actually,
Deserter.
a deserter. He was James Lewis and he deserted from the East India Company Army. And he then took on the persona of an American from Kentucky with the name Charles Masson. And he worked closely with the British, and so the British were quite pragmatic about such matters. But there are just many wonderful descriptions in his narrative of his journeys. And to me, the most important and relevant from the point of view of the story of how the Indus civilization got discovered is his description of Harappa. If you're looking for the first English language description which was published of Harappa, it is there in Charles Masson's account. The description is pretty accurate because he talks of these big mounds and he's on top of one of them and he talks about it as an ancient city. So, to that extent, the fact that Harappa is marked by mounds and marks a place where an ancient city remains buried is very well captured there, and it's absolutely accurate. But Masson was looking at the Indian landscape, including Harappa, from the perspective of classical lens. It's the classical accounts that he is fascinated with. And it shouldn't surprise us because studying the classics was such an important part of a good British education. That's what was done in the universities in England and so on and so forth. So when it came down to identifying Harappa, he fell back on those classical accounts. And he felt that Harappa was actually a place that was, attacked by Alexander in the late 4th century BCE. And he felt that the place, its name really was Sangala. So in that sense, there is something in his account which is very meaningful. But there's the other part, which is the interpretation of what he sees below his feet, which actually, as we know, is incorrect. And by the way, this is true not just for travelers and these buccaneers who were just moving around, India, the Northwest, and Afghanistan, and also beyond. This is also true for archaeologists. So you mentioned Alexander Cunningham. And, if you think about it, by the time Alexander Cunningham in the early 1870s is excavating Harappa, I mean, before this, and then publishing the account.
He's haunted by the specter of Yuan Sang, yeah.
Of Xuan Sang.
Yeah.
Again, because he's used Chinese accounts to actually very accurately identify a whole number of places across North India. So, we have to give it to him that he's the person who gives ancient India a kind of material reality. So if we know where Kaushambi is and where, Tamralipti in Bengal is, it's because of Cunningham. But when it came to identifying Harappa, he's excavated it, he's found material which doesn't quite fit in with the paradigm, of historical India, the sites he's been working with. Because if you look at the plate that he published, there is a seal there in unknown writing. There are stone flints, these flint blades that are there. There is pottery. This kind of mundane stuff Cunningham did not publish most of the time. And so he must have known that this is an aberration. But when it came to identifying it, he couldn't make that leap of imagination to see that he was in the presence of something which was very different and much older than, the ancient India he was familiar with.
That's so right. One of the things you also do here is assign a great deal of sincere respectability also to the points of view of the locals who offer their own myths, if I may use that word, or memories to these excavators or adventurers. They were not archaeologists yet. Cunningham was, of course, in the making. They offer their own stories, and the book begins, in fact, with the contrast between the perception of Harappa as a city which fell to pieces following an incest committed by its king, which the locals believed, to with the statement by Marshall in 1924 that it is a breakthrough discovery, that it sets the past of Indian civilization to a hitherto unprecedented antiquity. So you argue that archaeology in India sort of is born in these 50 years as a process, if not as a phenomenon. So that takes us directly to John Marshall and the people. How did John Marshall sort of work out an independent path, as it were, which really discounts to a very large extent the local myths and memories and charts out a very, very different paradigm of interpretation?
So, as far as, and I presume you're asking this with regard to how the Indus civilization was discovered. So, the first thing to remember about John Marshall is that he was actually trained in the Mediterranean and Crete. So, in terms of field knowledge, before he came to India, he was aware of a Bronze Age phenomenon in the European context. So I think his training mattered. The second thing, of course, is that he had been very intrigued by the seals of Harappa. And he remembers that, across the time that he is before the discovery of 1924. And so one of his most favorite officers, Dayaram Sahni, post World War II, is then sent to excavate Harappa. He, in a sense, hands over the baton of Harappa to Dayaram Sahni. Now, in the whole process of actually coming to excavate Harappa, there are many roadblocks before that. And I think one needs to keep those in mind when one looks at how excavations take place. It's not just a question of this archaeologist with a background in Bronze Age discoveries and so on and so forth, coming and deciding to excavate Harappa, which he thinks is very promising. Uh, he's working in a department of the British Raj, a department which actually has a small budget. And, if you look at that, so, when he asks very early in the first decade of the 20th century, he asks that the, commissioner of Montgomery that please, I want to acquire these mounts. The commissioner says it's possible and this is the amount it will be. It's not a large amount, but Marshall hesitates because that's the amount, a few thousand rupees, that has been spent on field research all over India and Burma. So he then decides to get it vetted and he gets 3 archaeologists to go there. Now, while all this is happening, and the third senior officer of his department decided to actually recommend the excavations, World War One, what we now call World War One, but then the Great War, as it was known, breaks out. So there's a moratorium on excavations. So, in other words, what I'm saying is it's not just a question of having an intuition, and an intuition which you nurse, in your head and in your mind across years. But it's an intuition which faces financial constraints. And eventually, this gets to be excavated much later in the early, part of the third decade of the 20th century. Now, Dayaram Sahni, if you read his report, he has a sense that this is earlier than anything in terms of settlement sites. He's talking about it as being pre-Mauryan. But we are still at that point in time only thinking about a unique site, not a civilization. The next kind of landmark in this whole process is the excavation of Mohenjo-daro.
Mohenjo-daro, yeah.
And there too, it's really interesting that Rakaldas Banerjee, who's remembered as the man from Mohenjo-daro, does not go to excavate the Mohenjo-daro we know. He goes to excavate Buddhist Mohenjo-daro. It's just that he's a trained archaeologist. And so when one of his assistants, N.S. Chikte, who was a PWD guy, found a seal, in the platform that is below the citadel on which this stupa stands, Rakaldas Banerjee could immediately figure out that this is exactly what had been found at Harappa from the time of Cunningham, but also by Dayaram Sahni. He took his own time in reporting this to John Marshall. The discovery of the first seal at Mohenjo-daro happens in 1922, in the winter of 1922, December. And he reports this to him in March 1923. Marshall is very excited because the idea is that you're now looking at a culture which is spread across hundreds of kilometers. But he's about to go on furlough. So he instructs Rakuldas Banerjee to try and work out the chronology and the features of what he has found in relation to Harappa, which I think Banerjee didn't do very successfully. And then Marshall comes back in December. On his instructions, Harappa and then Mohenjo-daro after that are both going to be excavated. But he doesn't go to either Harappa or Mohenjo-daro. He goes to Taxila, which he has been excavating over a long period of time. And I think the final push really comes with a letter that he receives from the young archaeologist at that point, Madhav Swarupa, a very junior officer of the ASI, who wrote to him in April that, look, what is common is not just the seals, it's the same type of bricks, it's a kindred terracotta art. So what you're looking at is much beyond just the seals. I think this is when John Marshall felt that he had to come to grips with what had been discovered at Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, and he gets the archaeologists and the material to Shimla, his head office. And I think when the material is spread out before all of them, that's when the fact that they were in the presence of a city civilization, which was pre-iron, that is, it's before the widespread use of iron, that's when it strikes them. So when people often ask me, where was the Indus civilization discovered, I always tell them it was discovered in Shimla, because that is where the significance of what had been found at Harappa and Mohenjo-daro was understood.
I am excited really about the way you connect these dots and happen almost at every page to throw up a surprise to readers who aren't specialists. I try and give a couple of examples to carry forward from where you stopped. For example, you also talk about the ways in which contingency plays roles, important roles in the discovery or delay, or in some ways, disruption of these process. You talk, for instance, about the loss of bricks of many of these ruin structures in the 1850s, when there's a great surge of interest in building the railways. I think Cunningham writes at some point that, or one of his associates does, that nearly a few miles, several miles of the railway's ballast is were built by pilfering bricks from these ruins, and that must have considerably reduced our exposure to the Indus Valley civilization. What are some of these incidental points? Because here clearly you connect environmental history, ecology, historiography, chance discoveries with or which keep punctuating what we as students were told to sort of play down as grand narratives. These tell us a few of these small stories which interest non-historians, other readers, and so on. Like the archaeological survey was about to be shut down in 1907, and you write about that, and Lord Curzon practically revives it with a strong advocacy. He's a bad guy to us bongs, but that's another story altogether.
So I think this was not deliberate, but looking back, with the benefit of retrospective appraisal, I would say that this really reveals to you how, when you look at an individual, who you are analyzing as a historian, you need to disaggregate parts of him. So the Bengalis don't like Curzon, but Anirban, I would say that of all the rulers that modern India has had, and that includes all the prime ministers of India, if there was one ruler who really cared about monuments, it was George Nathaniel Curzon. There's absolutely no two ways about it. There are imperial agendas, all that, but there's a genuine love of monuments. He has this even in Britain before he comes here. He argues for the return, for instance, of the Elgin marbles
Yeah.
back to Greece. That has still not happened. But that a member of the establishment, is doing this is really quite amazing. So I think we have to look at individuals in terms of, I mean, not in terms of a single fit. This is true also for archaeologists. So take a man like John Marshall. John Marshall, when he is writing about the discovery of the Indus civilization, whether it is in the Illustrated London News or it is in the newspapers of India shortly after this, is actually harping on how indigenous this civilization is and that it represents centuries of development on the Indian soil. It strikes almost a nationalist note, certainly. And I think, Marshall may have well used this language, apart from him believing this was so, because he wanted to push his government to give more funds for excavations. And it's one of the high points of the national movement at that point in time. Gandhi is a bad word and so on and so forth. And he does succeed in getting a few lakhs of rupees for that reason. For somebody who was working, who could only afford to give enough money for a 1 month excavation, which Madhav Sarup once did, to a time when you're looking at a few lakhs of rupees from the government budget for this. So, there is that part of him. But if you look at his work on Taxila, in the context of Taxila, because of the Greek elements and so on and so forth, the manner in which he sees Taxila is very much from the perspective of where he was trained. The Mediterranean area, the Greek heritage, and so on and so forth. So we cannot look, for example, just as you can't look at Curzon as just a bad guy. In the case of John Marshall, too, you cannot sort of see him as arguing just in one particular way. There are different phases in his career, and he looks at sites differently depending upon the kind of intellectual baggage that he's carrying with him at that point in time. Now, as far as the question that you began with, which was the brick robbing that happened at Harappa and so on and so forth. So, I mean, there are two things here. One, of course, is very well known to modern historians like you, which is that, when you talk about something like the advent of the railways, uh, you know, that development happens at a huge cost to the environment, but not just to the natural environment by the cutting of trees, but also to India's built heritage, to the built heritage. So, natural heritage and built heritage both suffer as a consequence of what is, of course, a major, it's a revolutionary way of connecting different parts of India as it is in the context of other parts of the world and so on and so forth. But the other thing that I wanted to point out in that chapter with the examples that I gave is that what is considered to be the discovery of India, the discovery of ancient India, is often, it involves the British Sahibs pilfering a whole lot of monuments and taking away stuff,
To the
to the
British Museum and so on. Yeah,
the British
absolutely.
museums are all
Yeah, yeah.
made from what was looted from the countries that were colonized. So, there are two faces to all of this. So, the British discovery is there. The great discoveries cannot be taken away from people, for example, like James Prinsep. The cracking, I think we have to appreciate that everything is not agenda. There is a leap of imagination in the work of James Prinsess where he sits down with all these inscriptions, small inscriptions from different places, to work out what the various characters in the Brahmi script stand for. And he uses that then to decipher the earliest at that point scripts, as we now know, inscriptions of Emperor Ashoka. So I think it's important to tell an untidy story.
You
And
do
it's
that
not, yeah,
actually.
and it's not deliberate. It's something. If a historian does not have an agenda, that you're not trying to push a particular line, you will say, okay, this is what is emerging, and surely this is fascinating, and that's what real life is about. Real life is untidy, and so is all of the reconstructions that we do as far as the ancient and the more modern pasts are concerned.
Yeah, it comes across so clearly if anyone is willing to read, not even between the lines, with the lines, that people, binaries, conflicts merge, talk back even to one another at various stages. A related question, really, since we are going very, very quickly, there's so many questions I thought I'd ask, is how does the book, and you also as a historian, look at the relationship against such backgrounds of the Indians and the British officials of the Archaeological Survey of India? I mean, we grew up reading, I am a generation younger to you, but even when I was in school and college, we grew up reading these how do I put it, contrarian narratives really of this Indian officials constantly struggling against the domination of their British superiors, not being given due credit, and so on and so forth. But coming to your chapters on both Sahni and Banerjee, I find that one needs also to desegregate various layers and levels of operations of these officials of the survey, and their juniors in turn that they also supervise. And it offers a great an instructive lesson on how to read not just primary but also secondary material. And I'm, as a student of modern history, grateful to you for that. So how do you look at biographies really as sources of history? And much more so, in fact, than they used to be, at least even a generation ago. And the relation between Indians and the British in the survey.
As far as the relations of Indians and the British in the survey are concerned, remember during British India itself, in the 1930s, you do have an Indian archaeologist becoming the Director General, which is K.N. Dikshit.
Dikshitar.
Before Dikshit, you already have Dayaram Sahni as the Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India. So, at one level, archaeologists who were of Indian origin did actually make it to the top post in the Archaeological Survey of India. There's absolutely no doubt about it. Having said that, when it comes to looking at, are there, for instance, tensions which you could see as tensions relating to race in the files? Because the Archaeological Survey of India published records do not have any of that. They don't have any of that because it's a very sanitized sort of, account with whatever is mentioned there. But beyond that, what about the files? In the files, you do get, not between Dayaram Sahni and Marshall, between Rakhaldas Banerjee and Marshall, but you get it when Mohenjo-daro becomes, is being excavated. It's this big site. Marshall is not there. He's somewhere else. There's a visitor, an important British visitor. I'm forgetting his name. This is not in my book because it wasn't relevant. But and he's very upset with the way he's treated by the Indian archaeology officers. And there's some kind of to and fro there. And you do feel that, well, there must have been, problems there. These issues did exist. So, as far as looking at the files from this perspective is concerned, I think there is a story waiting to be written about it. This was not my major concern. And even that material is still with me because, when you even write anew afterward, you want to put in things which, for the most, are relevant to what you are talking about. But having seen those files, I think this is something which ought to be explored. I'm sure there's enough material there.
Time for a new PhD project. I wish I were 20 years younger, but I'd be very interested to look into some of those someday. Moving on, I was also sort of interested about the other side of, or the other project that you've helmed, that of Ashoka. And in Ashoka, I'll be very brief for want of time. Once again, you connect archaeology, literary material, with contemporary people and realities. Memories play a major role in all of your work, almost all at any rate. The local communities, as they live now, or even as they lived and spoke to investigators in the past, often come up in your work as important players. Well, not perhaps directly through their voice, but also as you recover their voices from the reports or memories of these investigators. How do you look at those who live in the vicinity of these archaeological sites? I mean, the only other historian who've done this, a medieval historian, and that made me extremely enthused again reading him, is Sunil Kumar. He has this collection of essays called essays past in the present, sort of as if he was taking along a conducted tour of these sites over 1,000 years. Something similar comes up in your work too. What was it in the early 90s when all of you were thinking together along these lines? Some of you at any rate, if not all. Yeah.
In this, I would say, Anirban, that the major watershed was to do, I didn't do it for this, but it was a watershed in terms of what I discovered on the ground. This was a field survey that I did of a part of Faridabad district of Haryana, the Ballabgarh Tehsil. When you think of Faridabad, you think of factories and industrial installations and all that. But actually, behind that, there's a whole rural universe which, we discovered. I was working with a friend and colleague, Upinder Singh, and we were looking for the early settlement history of that area. What we found was that actually material remnants, especially sculpture and so on and so forth, survive, architectural pieces, when they are valued by people who live in their vicinity. Those are placed on folk shrines and worshipped. That's how this has survived. So, for the first time, I realized that there are many ways of preservation. There's the Western system, museumization, and all that. But there is an indigenous, non museum, ground level practice where people, what they value and valorize, and what they then appropriate and sort of, interweave with their mythologies and legends, allows that past to survive. So, that's where I first realized this. And I realized with it that how incomplete my own education was. We were always preoccupied with the texts when it came to looking at religion, which actually talked about the fact that you don't worship broken sculpture. But on the ground, on the contrary, what we found was in the heartland of North India, material that was totally broken, but which was being worshipped. And it was in folk shrines, so it did not require the intervention of a Brahmin and so on and so forth. So, people are not tyrannized by textual notions. And it's from that I realized that a lot actually gets discovered because there are people on the ground who have preserved this. So I call this living antiquarianism. It's a practice, it's an indigenous practice, and I've seen that after Ballabgarh all over. And I also look back at my own I'm cross with myself that I didn't notice in the Cunningham volumes when I had read them that he gives many examples of this. For example, of the Buddha being worshipped as a Devi, to whom now, blood sacrifices are being offered, meat is being offered. When he talks of Harappa, where these ring stones are thought to be the bangles
Yeah.
of
Fakir.
yes.
Yeah. And the fakir is Naugazi and the large. And yeah,
Yeah,
of
and that's
course.
why
Yeah.
those
Yeah.
those
Yeah.
work as bangles.
Right.
All this has
Yeah.
survived for
Right.
that reason. So I have great respect and a great fascination, and I feel very humble in the company of people on the ground because they have just such interesting insights and they have saved a great deal because of this attitude.
Lovely. So I'll have only two more questions, but let me ask the second last question, which you anticipate and elaborate in some length at the afterword. Let me make it very bold. How do you think historical discoveries happen? You actually offer a model finally in the afterword.
So, I was interested in then expanding. I felt that I needed to look at this discovery in terms of other discoveries. And I thought immediately of scientific and technological discoveries. And there were many elements there which actually helped me understand how this or rather to contextualize it within a frame that goes beyond just the discovery of the Indus civilization. One was the idea of the slow hunch, which is there in this book which I mentioned there, where good ideas come from, Sim Johnson's book. And he gives many examples of scientists who take a long time to actually come to make their major discoveries. And I thought immediately of John Marshall, who first engages, if you look at the genealogy of his engagement with things Harappan, it goes back to before he comes to India. And eventually, it attains fruition only in 1924. It's a nursing of this slow hunch, which is very important. I also try to understand what is it that is missing in this, which maybe, if institutions had functioned like the way in which scientists work, things may have been done faster. So, for instance, lab meetings are very common among scientists. So, constantly meeting and talking about what has come out, where there's an aberration, and so on and so forth. Nothing like that existed within the archaeological survey. So you had Marshall doing his thing, you had Banerjee discovering these seals. After many months, he comes to Marshall. Marshall advises him. But there isn't a brainstorming, there isn't a space where archaeologists regularly met and, did things. But you can look at Marshall, it's not a question of just criticizing the survey, but think of John Marshall himself. He realizes there's something very unusual what has come out of Mohenjo-daro, but he's so rigidly disciplined that he doesn't go when he comes back to India to either Mohenjo-daro or Harappa. He chooses to go to Taxila, to the place where he's been overseeing these large excavations. If he had been less disciplined, maybe the discovery of the Indus civilization would have taken place earlier. And here too, I mean, if you think of Darwin, for example, and the amount of time that he took to eventually put out what he had discovered, you get a sort of a similar sense. So I think I learned a lot from reading about how discoveries take place elsewhere in other fields. And I've tried to bring some of that into the first part of my new afterword.
Right. This will be my last question, so it will be large. I have two or three things in mind. Let me try to combine them. One is, of course, the most obvious one. Where do you go from here? What's coming to us, let's say, over the next 2, 3 years by way of your next book? The other is the nature of your engagement really with the presentness, for want of a better word, of the past that has informed all your work over the last quarter century or so, seems to me to offer to many of us hopes that it'll be possible now for historians of modern and medieval India to in some way collaborate with historians and archaeologists and do something together where one looks at questions like environmental damage, ecology, cohabitation through times between people and nature and relics, along with changes in historiography in a much larger sense. A few words of observation on these possibilities. And finally, do you have any suggestions for new projects that others could take up along these lines? I've asked too many questions. Choose to answer the ones you want to.
Okay, so I'll begin with your second question first, which is about the contemporary relevance of and the presentness of the past, in a manner of speaking. I think this is something which is there in what surrounds us in all kinds of ways. So I teach a course in Ashoka University on Indian civilizations. And clearly, when you talk about important moments in the past, you draw attention, for example, to Kalidas. And when you talk of Kalidas, you will talk about Meghadoot. And you can easily make the connection with modern India because if you think of a Rabindranath Tagore and his engagement with Meghadoot and what he does, both with Geeta Govinda and with Meghadoot, you get a feeling that, this idea of the past being present in the countryside, in living antiquarianism, as I said, the past being present there is also present in the minds of some of the greats that form a part of modern India. Tagore to me is a good example of that. Or you think of a Gandhi and Bhagavad Gita. Yeah. And what he does with the Bhagavad Gita is completely different from the way ancient Indians thought of it, or even scholars of ancient India think, of the Bhagavad Gita. You think of the British who ruled us. Look at all the elements in their architecture where, the past is being invoked. No Indians bought into that. So when, for example, what we call today New Delhi was built, and if you read the works and the file material and the publications on how was then the Viceregal House, but the present Rashtrapati Bhavan was aligned. It was very deliberately aligned on the one hand with Purana Killa, which was an ancient capital, and on the other hand, it was aligned with the Jama Masjid, with Shah Jahanabad, which represented medieval. So the British are trying to see themselves in terms of that continuum. That's what they are putting out in the public domain. So the past is not dead for them. The past has all kinds of uses. Or you think of a Nehru and his engagement with Buddhism, and the way in which he put in elements of Ashoka into our national symbols. If you think about the Sarnath pillar is very much a Buddhist symbol, but he makes it much larger, he makes it much more inclusive. He talks about the chakra being a part of, a long period of time in other religions. And then you have Vasudev Sharan Agrawal, a historian who comes and produces a book which actually tries to put this argument into a historical form.
Ah,
Second, thing about what is it that I'm working on? I'm actually working very far away from the Indus great cities or from the great Emperor Ashok. At some point in my middle age, I have realized that there is one very large part of India, which was much larger than cities and great kings and their capitals, is represented by the forest and wilderness. There were many more forests in ancient India. The land would have been much more forested with islands of tillage, in a manner of speaking. And I haven't ever researched that. So I did then approach the Madhya Pradesh Forest Department. I was also a bit nervous, having never done this. And eventually they gave me permission to work in the Bandhavgarh uh, National Park and Tiger Reserve. And that's where I have been working for the last 3 years in order to see what is it, how do you bring the forests into the narrative? Who are the people who use the forest? How does it change, let's say, from the prehistoric to the modern, as a manner of speaking, when it becomes a reserve park and so on and so forth. So that's what I'm working on currently. And my advice to people the younger generation would be that, look, we really need to pay much more attention to forested areas. These are areas which have a great deal of the material past, and it's preserved very well. I mean, this also has public policy implications. I've done field work in, say, Ballabgarh, where sites disappear at an alarming rate. But on the other hand, I've also worked in a forest where things are much better preserved. So, what does this tell us about the landscape, being preserved along with the monuments? Should only monuments and sites be preserved? Or if you preserve larger landscapes, things will survive much better. So that's what.
that probably is a wonderful note with which to conclude this conversation, though it will remain tantalizing for me. There are about 25 more questions I had in my head, but we'll have hopefully other occasions to get them back at you again. Thank you so much, Professor Lahiri, for your time, for your generosity, and for helping us connect so many dots over this hour or so. You spoke about interconnected histories. You spoke about possibilities cutting across the three periods of history. You spoke about possibilities of expanding, if I may use the word, the ecology of writing histories, engaging much more with landscape that were preserved and the processes and elisions through which they were or were not preserved, including landscapes such as institutions. There is much more to gain, but I'd request the listeners at any rate to try and read books like Finding Forgotten Cities and other books that Professor Lahiri wrote and other historians do. But one particular virtue of this book that I found, and I must recommend to you, is the way it speaks to the lay audience without any particular training in history or its details. So there are ways in which books that she wrote, several of them can be read also by youngsters or pretty much anybody with any basic interest in India's pasts and the making of India's pasts and how they live in our contemporary times and societies. With this, we have to conclude this episode. I look forward to returning with the next episode. Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure to talk to you.